With me is Captain Scott Tate, formerly of the U.S. Navy. Scott, thank you so much for joining us. Now, the first thing I have to get out of the way before we begin is that I went to The Ohio State University. You're a graduate of the University of Michigan. We're going to try and keep this as civil as possible.
We'll do our best.
Okay, we'll do our best.
Always a pleasure.
Thank you, Scott. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I grew up in your neck of the woods.
Right.
Grew up in the Detroit area, worked in tool shops and whatnot. Didn't know exactly what I wanted to do, but knew I liked being out on the water. So I did find my way into the Navy through the University of Michigan NROTC program. I had the privilege of serving 27 years in the Navy, got to command a couple of ships. I was a ship driver, surface warfare officer, do a few interesting staff jobs ashore, senior staffs, and I now have the good fortune to be here at UC San Diego running the National Security Innovation Catalyst and also to be the CEO of a local company called Pacific Science and Engineering where we develop human-machine interfaces for high-consequence systems.
Very interesting. To begin with, how do you define adversity?
Well, having caused most of my own adversity, I've had more experience than most probably. Yeah, I think you're right. You know, defining adversity is important because we tend to see it inherently as a negative thing. And you know, one of the best ways to overcome it is to see it as both an opportunity as well as a challenge. And when you're facing something that might not be pleasant or might not be familiar, if you can look at that as a way to improve yourself as well as something that you've got to overcome. One fun story comes to mind. We were refueling at sea where you drive your ship up alongside a very large oil ship, and we were in the middle of an operation that was important enough that we couldn't go off station and couldn't go to calmer weather, so we were in the middle of a big storm trying to do oil, and the two ships were getting very unpleasantly close together due to the wave action. And I remember talking to the master on the oiler over the radio and saying, hey, you know, clearly I was getting a little shaky. I'm like, Captain, you still good with this? He was an old-timer from Maine, and you hear this pause, and then he comes back with, son, bad weather makes good sailors. That has always kind of stuck with me, right? You know, if they give you a storm, hey, learn how to sail better.
It kind of it brings me back to something that you and I are both interested in, which is Stoic philosophy. Mm-hmm. And one of the Stoic kind of points is the idea that the obstacle is the way. And I think that kind of alludes to what you were just speaking of, that we're going to face obstacles, we're going to face adversity, and ultimately that's going to kind of become the path, not so much as looking at it as and the obstacle that it is, but accepting it and saying, this is becoming part of the path that I'm walking. Can you speak to that to any degree?
Sure. I mean, I was a philosophy minor as an undergrad, and Stoic philosophy meant a lot to me and always has. I think it's often misinterpreted as being people who thrive on pain or seek pain, which is not the case at all. You know, I love the writings, the meditations of Marcus Aurelius, where he says simple things like, you know, love only what has happened. That's the greatest harmony. Don't want it to be different than it is. Just simply accepting in life that there are facts and then there are challenges. And challenges are things that you can control, influence, maybe overcome. Facts are just facts. And if you allow yourself to be frustrated by the fact that you can't manipulate them, you can't control them, it may actually add to your sense that you're in an adversarial environment. And if you can just identify those things that are simply facts and let them go, you're probably going to be in a much better place.
Having spent the time that you did in the military, is there any kind of systemic process that one can look at or that you were taught in the military to kind of identify adversity and to work through it to any degree?
Well, almost all the training that we do is around dealing with some type of adversity, whether it's physical adversity, emotional adversity, or intellectual adversity. The training processes are what I often thought of as like an inoculation, stress inoculation or an adversity inoculation. By controlling the intensity and the duration of the artificial adversity, you give people a chance to build their coping mechanisms, even subconsciously. The fact that they've been through those environments before, they wind up developing natural resistance and resilience to it in ways that they wouldn't if they were just facing it in the real world for the first time. Right. So I think really all the training we do is around some sort of coping mechanism development for adversity in one form or another.
Interesting. So kind of preparing for adversity is one of the things that will help you get through adversity.
Absolutely, because everything is relative. Right? When we look at what we see as adversarial in our lives today, if you can maintain a perspective, whether that's a philosophical perspective as the Stoics did, or a historical perspective where you think back on what other people have been through and accomplished despite facing arguably much harder circumstances than what almost any of us are going to face in our lives. It just kind of helps you get through it without, without feeling like you're in a situation you can't possibly hope to overcome on your own.
Are there any differences between how we can approach adversity on a singular level as opposed to a group level?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting contrast, right? And in a group level, you have the ability to draw on each other for strength. You also have the risk that it becomes kind of a negative echo chamber. Mm-hmm. And somebody, a natural leader, if there's not a structural leader in that group, is going to set that tone. So if you find yourself in a group facing an adversarial situation and there isn't a structural hierarchy of leadership, you probably want to inject yourself as at least the tone setter to try to make it into a positive experience rather than a negative one. When I was about 12 years old, my grandfather had a cabin cruiser and we were heading from southern Michigan up to Mackinac at the very north, and about a mile and a half offshore ran over some rocks that weren't on the chart and tore the bottom out of the thing and found ourselves in the water hanging on to whatever was still floating. And by the time we had swum ashore, we realized we were also several miles from anything like a road. And my grandmother just turned it into a game for the kids. And, we could have been terrified, we could have been panicked, but she made it really fun. And there was no reason she would do that, she just did it, right? So yeah, I think in a group setting, it's important for somebody to step forward as a tone setter that kind of leads the way emotionally and intellectually of how you're going to get through it. At an individual level, and I guess this applies to groups as well, you always want to think about what's on the other side of the adversity. You got to have a vision in your mind of an end state that is a better place that you want to get to. I think Churchill said, when you're going through hell, keep going. Right. But you got to know what you're going to, and just identifying what that end state is that gets you through the period of adversity, or what your desired end state is, can often make the endurance of whatever it is you're dealing with, I think, a lot easier. But you do see people that see the adversity as a wall that they can't get over rather than as some kind of a forest that they just have to find their way through. There's a wonderful book that I would recommend to anybody called Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but he was a Holocaust survivor and was somewhat haunted by the fact that he survived and others didn't. Not so much in survivor's guilt, but as he didn't understand why, because he knew he wasn't physically the strongest, he knew he wasn't intellectually the strongest, but he had survived when people that he considered to be better than himself had not. And so he did quite a bit of research after the war by way of interviewing other survivors, and what he found was kind of an almost universally common trait was that the survivors had they had a purpose. They had something they wanted to accomplish in their life that they knew if they died in the camp, it would never get done. And that sense of purpose of having something that you want to accomplish that's going to drive you through whatever adversity you may face. He later actually, here in San Diego, founded a school of psychology.
Yeah, that's something that I found in my life, and I maybe you can speak to that to a degree. Like you said, having a purpose. How important is it to find some kind of a purpose or some kind of goal, as opposed to kind of just allowing life to happen?
A good friend named Greg Shepard, who's a local entrepreneur and investor, when he coaches young people who want to start a company, the first thing he forces them to do is create what he calls the North Star, which is their purpose. What do they want to achieve in the world through this company or product? What do they want to get out of it personally? And when he calls it the North Star, what he means is, when you're navigating from point A to point B, you're almost never going to go from point A to point B, especially as an entrepreneur. There's going to be lots of pivots, lots of course changes, but if you have the North Star, you've got something that's constant that you can adjust course to and know where you are relatively. Right. So I think purpose is extremely important, possibly the most important thing.
I want to take a step back for a second to the story you told about your grandmother, right, and when you got back on shore. Something that brought to my mind was the idea of how we react to adversity, right? Whatever that might be. How important is it to, obviously we are emotional creatures, right? But how important is it to try to temper our emotions when we face adversity and begin to try to look at things logically or systematically to get through whatever trouble it is we're facing?
Three things. Tempering your emotions in the right circumstances are good. Drawing on them can be equally good. So I would never recommend a universal response of, okay, the first thing I have to do is tamp my, your fight or flight, and you can spend more time trying to manage emotions than you're spending trying to get through the problem. I think the second thing is, if you're in a situation and you're fighting your own nature, trying to be something you're not, you will rarely succeed. One of the first things we teach young people about becoming leaders is you're going to have to develop your own leadership style. Right? There's no formula. You're going to have to develop your own adversarial condition response mechanism that is uniquely yours, that balances your emotions and your reason, that just suits the style that works for you. You can't suddenly become someone or something that you're not.
An interesting thing that you brought up again earlier in the conversation was this idea of looking at a problem as a wall as opposed to one tree within the forest. What advice do you have when a problem arises and you do rise to meet that problem, but even if you solve that problem, perhaps new problems arise from that, right, and splinter, and now you have more obstacles to overcome? What can you speak to that process?
Yeah, expect that. That is the human process. You're going to solve the thing that's, as we say, you're going to shoot the wolf that's nearest to your sled, but there's a whole pack behind that one. And half the time, your initial solution may cause more problems than it solves, regardless of what your situation is, whether it's a plane wreck or a business setting. Just expect that. Don't let it deter you. Don't let it depress you. It's going to happen, and know that that's part of getting to that final end state. Right? You may not know exactly where that end state is or how long it's going to take you to get there, and you should always anticipate that there will be a good many challenges that come up between here and there. To that point, right, one of the ways that we train that in the military is, like, when we take people out on runs, we'll tell them it's going to be a 2-mile run, and we'll go a mile out and a mile back, and then pass by what they thought was going to be the finish point, and then do it again, and then do it again, just to train them into never expecting that where they think the finish point will really be where they get to stop. Expect the unexpected. Try to maintain enough physical, mental, and emotional reserve to deal with it, but just expect it. That way you won't be shocked or surprised or disappointed when it happens.
One of the things you brought up earlier was that going through adversity within a group, one of the benefits of that is kind of being able to deal with the problem within the group and not just being on your own. Do you have any recommendations or suggestions or thoughts in regards to whether a person is going through a problem in a group or whether a person is going through a problem on their own, how they might be able to take some of the weight off their shoulders to lean on others to some degree?
Sure. I mean, groups are always both a blessing and a curse.
Yeah.
That's why democracy is as messy as it is. The strength of all of us is immense, but how we harness that strength can oftentimes be very clumsy. Right. Smaller groups are no different. You have to, I would say you have to pick and choose the right people at the right time to have them shoulder a burden with you. And you also have to decide when you rely on others, you're to some degree abdicating the responsibility that you hold for solving the problem. Right. So partnering with people where you both have a benefit at the end of this, I think is good. Just trying to shed things in any direction is probably not going to be very useful for you.
Absolutely. Looking back, obviously you're a student of history. Mm-hmm. Looking back through history, are there any moments that you might bring to our mind to illustrate examples of one overcoming adversity?
Well, when you look at the group setting and look at the Black Plague in Europe, I mean, it just amazes me that
we made it through.
That they made it through.
Yeah.
I mean, when you look at the hardships that people endured, that they were able to maintain some sort of a society, yeah, it just still floors me that we've made it through some of those types of events in history. I was part of the relief effort after the tsunami in Japan, and the way the Japanese pulled together and under incredible hardship was just phenomenal to watch. I think having a historical setting, a historical context in which you kind of measure your own level of adversity is often very useful because it's encouraging. Right? It reminds you that it could be worse. It could be worse, and others have gotten through worse. On an individual setting, I know that Churchill wasn't perfect, but when you look at his leadership of England in 1940, 1941, just really incredible. And when there was no reason to believe they were going to survive, he held it all together and kind of provided them that end state. Keep the eyes on the end state. We'll get through what we're dealing with today.
Scott, who are perhaps some of your role models that you look to and that you might suggest others study to a degree in terms of learning to overcome adversity?
Well, I'm an American, so most of my reading is about Americans and American history. Not all of it, but a lot. First, I would say look at people who did great and good things in times of extreme change. We talk a lot about how technologies are shaping and changing our society today, and I think they are, but when I look back at, like, say, even just my great-grandmother's life, she went literally from horse and buggy and the mail system to a world where she saw the first space shuttle fly. We haven't seen anything like technological disruption on that scale, where things are just fundamentally different. I would argue most of what we've seen, maybe not what we're going to see in the future, but most of what we've seen to date has been incremental improvement on technologies that would look familiar to people who were alive in the 40s and 50s, largely. But when you look at people who have led in times of true change, their biographies and their purpose, I think, are often very illuminating. I go back to Franklin Roosevelt. When you look at his leadership, as imperfect as it may have been, his ability to inspire us as a nation and bring us together and have a vision of the future that was very different from our collective vision of the future when he came to office. There's a wonderful vignette when he was at Mount Rushmore shortly after his first election, and someone asked him if he would be one of America's greatest presidents and if his face would someday be up there, and his response was, well, if I'm not one of the greatest, I'll probably be the last. I think when we look back on that period, we often believe it was inevitable that we were going to make it through it as a society. So Franklin Roosevelt is one. Teddy Roosevelt is another. It kind of dragged us kicking and screaming onto the world stage in a way that we weren't ready for, but if he had not thrust us forward in that way, World War I could have come out very differently, and the entire world political system could be very different than it is. And of course, Abe Lincoln. Unbelievable what he faced on a personal level, what was happening with his family, suffering the death of children, his unhappy marriage, the level of stress he was under as an individual as well as a professional is pretty incredible. I do still go back to the Founding Fathers, especially George Washington. Again, I think we look back at it with a sense of inevitability, but neither our military survival against the British nor our survival politically in the constitutional conventions were assured, and without his leadership and his serving essentially as an anchor for the cause, there's a fairly good chance we would not be here.
What do you think it was within Washington's character that really helped to kind of pin things together and keep things from falling apart, both during the war and after, during the creation of the Union itself?
When I look at Washington, I think he's the ultimate pragmatist. I mean, he was certainly a visionary and an ideologist, but of all the Founding Fathers, as a farmer, he was a real farmer, not the way Jefferson farmed.
Right.
Somebody who was an innovator and was, reading his letters, he was intimately involved in the running of the farm and the innovation of some of the technologies and the business planning. I think he was just very, very practical and pragmatic and grounded in a way that not all of them were. And was somehow able to balance that. And I do think he had a slight sense of insecurity because he was the only one that hadn't been to university and hadn't traveled as broadly as the others had, particularly to Europe. So an inner drive to need to prove himself continuously, even after his time as president.
We've talked a bit about historical adversity. I'm wondering, this course is kind of predicated on living in the 21st century and the times ahead. To your mind, what adversity do you think we might face moving into the future, both perhaps in terms of on an individual level, but absolutely in terms of society?
Well, my daughter Abigail is with us today, sitting off camera, and we actually had a discussion on the drive over where in school she was doing some reading about how kids are socializing much younger than they used to because they have access to all of this information that kids in our era, we simply did not. Right. Consequently, children as young as 5 are committing suicide. I think probably because you can, again, could be adversity or it could be a benefit, access to global information before you've been socialized to be able to process it. We look at the news and we're bombarded with messages of climate change and climate catastrophe, but we've been through several other tragedies and catastrophes and things, and we kind of have a sense of how the world reacts to these things.
What would be, I guess, your chief advice for someone about pushing through adversity? We're all going to face it. It's going to happen. That's part of life. What do you tell someone? What can they look towards? What should they think about to push through it and make it out to the other side?
Well, there are two parts to that. One is, again, trying to keep it in context. Even though it may seem like you're going through the worst thing that any human has ever gone through, you're not, almost certainly. Trying to contextualize it in a way that the Stoics would have appreciated, I think is key. And then the second is really that focus on an endpoint that's outside the adversarial period. Understanding that you've got a point beyond this situation that you can get to, that you want to get to. Even if it's not nirvana, it's better than what you're at now. And that you've got agency. People rarely feel despair if they feel a sense of agency. I remember watching an interview by a Japanese fighter pilot who said, we never felt fear till we ran out of ammo. As long as they were in the fight, they had agency, and they were not fearless, but he said when you run out of ammunition, now you feel fear. And that always kind of stuck with me, a very interesting perspective, that as long as you think you can still influence the situation, so look for those ways that you can influence it. Try to isolate the things that you can't influence and apply your Stoic philosophy. Identify the things that you can influence and do so, and always keep the focal point on the far side of the problem.
You spoke earlier in regards to, I guess, almost a sense of helplessness to a degree that some people might feel looking at the problems of today. And you brought up the fact that there have been problems in the past, And it's true. I think that oftentimes, obviously, we're living our lives. Each person is stuck in their own head. They have their own reality tunnel of the life that they're living. And whether it's on a personal level or whether it's on a global level, it can sometimes seem like there's so much wrong in the world that there is this sense of helplessness and hopelessness. I know a lot of people feel this way about the climate issue, right? Have we passed by the waypoints that we could to stop these issues? Are we too far gone? To my mind, when you look back at history, as you've said, there have been so many massive problems that the human race has faced over the years, but we've somehow managed to make it through.
Yep.
We've figured it out, we've gone on. And I feel, and I'm wondering if you feel, that even though there are great challenges ahead, and there will always be great challenges ahead, I feel that human beings and humanity, we can make it through. We have the ability to do that, no matter what the problem. Do you agree with that?
I do. I'm a huge optimist. I'm an optimist generally for humanity, and I'm a super optimist for America and our really unique system of overcoming problems. I think we do see more wrong now, but I think a lot of that is just we're aware of things in a way that we weren't aware because of modern communications. I think as a nation, we always look at what's wrong rather than what's right. That's just in our nature. We're a nation of type A people, and so if 95% of everything is great and getting better, we will find the 5% that needs fixed, and we'll drill on it. The one thing that gives me pause is I think the nature of several of the technologies and the mixture of technologies that we're developing today, whether it's biotech or AI or you name it, the convergence of those technologies, the speed at which they're developing, that interaction with what has made us successful in the past, this sense of optimism, the sense of hope, this hubris lets us do things that are seemingly impossible, mostly because we just go do them. a lot of the characteristics that gave us advantage in getting through past periods of trouble, combined with the technologies of today, there could be some really bad mistakes. We go try something before we really understand the second, third order consequences of it, or we pair up technologies that we don't understand how they're going to work together, and it just kind of gets away from us, because I think you can imagine several future technology-driven challenges where you don't get a second chance. Most of the problems we faced in the past, we could get it wrong a couple times before we got it right and still be okay. It doesn't mean the cost wouldn't be higher, but you weren't going to have an existential challenge on your hands. I'm not sure that's still the case today.
What resources or materials might you suggest to people to kind of delve a bit deeper and learn a bit more in regarding how they can overcome adversity?
Well, I think a lot of it does go back to the military approach to training. Mm-hmm. Don't wait till you're in a situation to prepare for it. Read things that will help you have context, whether that's history or biography of other people who are somewhat like you, who overcame great periods of stress or disorder, so that when you face them yourself, you have something at least to help contextualize it. Do think about the worst. And we're inclined not to think about the worst to avoid it, but doing some mind exercises of what's the worst thing that could happen. We do a lot of wargaming in the military, and war games don't tell you what the right answer is. But over time, they pretty quickly give you left and right limits of what the plausible solutions are and the plausible reactions are by an opponent or a state of nature. If you've done a little bit of that, even though you might not have focused on the exact scenario you're going to face in the future, it'll be a variation on a theme that you're already familiar with. And you'll have some nascent coping mechanisms. And humans are resilient creatures if we want to be. Military history is just littered with examples of people who had small wounds that shouldn't have been deadly but were because the person gave up or went into shock, and people who had wounds that should absolutely have been life-ending and they survived because they decided to. Any period of adversity is the same thing. You largely have to find the areas where you have agency, take charge of them, and have the will to fight, or if you choose not to, then don't expect a happy outcome.
Deal with the consequences.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Captain, thank you so much for joining us today. I appreciate your time.
My pleasure, Christian. Thank you.